I'm going to screen share. Oh, sorry, I guess because I'm a co-host, I have to approve the recording. There we go. Hopefully you should be good to
Yep,
go.
it says it's recording now.
Okay, so I would invite you to mute your lines, but please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question during the presentation, and then afterwards, of course, I'll open up for questions. So if you want to wait till the end, that's fine too. I just wanted to make you aware that I won't be muting anyone. You can mute and unmute yourself as you please. And so I'm going to screen share and I'm going to go through a PowerPoint presentation with you. So hopefully I don't bore you to tears. And that PowerPoint is going to go over imposter syndrome and what it kind of looks like. And then we're going to talk about the research that I actually conducted there as part of my master's thesis at Wichita State. And then we're going to talk about implications. What does that mean for graduate students? What does that mean for first-gen students? What do we do, right? So it should be really great. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. So just give me 1 second. Here we go.
Hang on 1 second. Hey, Tara, can you log into the November 20th meeting? It just sent me an email so that somebody started that meeting. It's supposed to be blocked out and they can't get into those other ones. This happens all the time. I didn't know if you have a way to direct them to us.
Yeah, let me try to get on it.
Okay.
Let's wait just 1 second so that hopefully they can come on over.
It happens all the time, and I know the link that I put on Shocker Blast is the right one, and then I emailed out the one, and then it's been kind of crazy. Sometimes somehow they get access to an old link and they use those, and then it's sad.
That's the worldwide interwebs, people. We don't know what's happening. Everybody knows, and yet nobody knows.
Zoom is the craziest thing ever sometimes too. It says that I don't know how it started the meeting because the university put the restriction on there where now you have to go into a lobby unless the host logs in before and takes that restriction off. Yeah. So I don't know how they got into that meeting even.
You said the November 20th one?
Yeah, it said that I can't remember what name it said. Franny Christensen. I don't think they're even on our roster. I do have her email. Oh, there she is.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and in the interest of time, go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen with all of you. And I can also make this available, the presentation that we're going to be reviewing today, available to you for you to review at your leisure if you would like. So let's just do that. So give me a thumbs up if you're seeing a presentation that says, "Are you a fraud?" Okay. Awesome. So like I said, we're going to go ahead and start by talking about imposter syndrome. And before we do that, I'm going to tell you why I am talking about this. Who am I? So my name is Ashley Ormond, and I am a 5th-year doctoral candidate at Wichita State in the psychology department. So I have a master's in education and leadership and administration, and then I have a master's in psychology. I am a licensed master's level clinical psychologist in the pursuit of my PhD. So I just proposed my dissertation and anticipate defending that dissertation in about a year's time. While obtaining my PhD, I had 2 babies, which was part of it. I just like to mention that to people because I think the topic that we're discussing, I find that is relevant because there are a lot of different kind of life situations that can impact how we see ourselves and how we interact with the world around us. So that was part of my journey of grad school, and so I like to include that little bit there. What I do as a clinical psychologist, just briefly, in case you're unfamiliar, is that I provide psychotherapeutic services. So I'm trained in evidence-based practices like cognitive behavior therapy, and I treat people for depression, anxiety, a variety of mood and behavioral disorders. My focus is on children. So I did a practicum at the University of Kansas School of Medicine, where I saw primarily children and adolescents and helped also with parent management training. And then I also was contracted with Wesley to do their suicide assessments for minors who come into the hospital unit there at Wesley. So that's kind of what I do. That's what my everyday looks like. This research, like I said, was conducted as part of my master's in clinical psychology, which again, I obtained at WSU. So a little bit of background about imposter syndrome. Now there's a couple of terms that we're going to kind of be throwing around, if you will. So I might say imposterism, imposter syndrome, also the imposter phenomenon. So these terms were first coined in 1970 by Pauline Rose Krantz. And what she was doing was that she was doing a study on high achieving women. I'm going to minimize this for a minute here. There we go. On high achieving women out of Georgia State University. And so what they were doing was they were conducting clinical observations. And what they found was that many of these women did not internalize their success. So what I mean by internalizing is that they were attributing their success to external factors. So maybe it was situational, right? Or maybe they would say, well, I just got lucky. But there was a consistent theme here, which was that a lot of these women, and again, the study in the 70s only included women at the time, were incredibly fearful that their fraudulence would be discovered or uncovered. All of a sudden, someone would say, you don't actually know what you're talking about, and you're not supposed to be here, and they would be caught. And so that's what kind of gave way to this body of evidence and this field of study. So Clance found that the lack of internalization was due to this cycle of thoughts and actions that are at the risk of being repetitive, cyclical in nature, right? So the fraudulence causes anxiety, and then you feel like you have to kind of keep up appearances and you want to be perfect and overcompensating. And so she came up with the Imposter Cycle. And that really came about in the 1980s, around 1985, as her research continued. Now, this image, which isn't showing up terribly clearly here, but this is what the imposter cycle actually looks like. So you have these feelings of that you're not good enough, that you're inadequate, that maybe you're not even supposed to be there, that it was just luck. Maybe someone misread your application and that's how you got in, whether that be graduate school or your career, right? And so this was the cycle that she came up with. Now, although the imposter cycle is the most common representation of imposter syndrome, it is most frequently referred to in the literature. The individual sections of the cycle, so individual traits and circumstances, also impact people. And that's what continued research has found, that you don't have to have all of these in order to be experiencing symptoms that are consistent with imposter syndrome. So in order to measure the individual components, Clance came up with what's called the Clance Imposter Syndrome Scale. It's abbreviated CIPS, CIPS, and we're gonna take a look at it actually in a little bit here because I used it as part of my study. But for now, what you need to know is the CIPS is a 20-item questionnaire, so it's pretty short, and it's designed to differentiate imposters from non-imposters. So keep that in mind and stay tuned as we look at what the CIPS actually is. Now, I do want to mention that it has a high level of internal consistency, and the alpha values of the CIPS range from 0.8 to 0.96. So the internal consistency is really strong. We strongly believe, and research has proven over time, that it measures exactly what it's supposed to measure. This construct is not something that is just nebulous and unmeasurable. In fact, it's quite easy to measure when we use the right scales. So, the relevance. Since Clance's original discovery in 1970, the CIPS has been used in many populations and settings, and settings, excuse me, and research has found that imposter syndrome actually exists with a similar frequency in men as it does in women. Now, this was especially important because, as you recall, in 1970, when Clance first started this, she was only looking at women. And that was partially because of the social times and stuff like that. But over time, as they've expanded, they found that it's pretty consistent across genders, and that is not only limited to the gender binary. It's pretty consistent across people who don't identify as men or women, but who identify with another gender as well. So today, it is actually estimated that 70% of people will experience at least one episode of imposter syndrome in their lives. So that's greater than the majority. And this includes students and young adults. In fact, emerging theories indicate that imposter phenomenon seems to be more common among people who are embarking on a new endeavor. So while this is true of many students, a study that was published in 2013, well, it was actually more of like an article because it included more qualitative data, but what they looked at was graduate students, and they actually interviewed a lot of graduate students. And what they found was that graduate students may be particularly at risk. Carol Lieberman, who is actually a physician, she was interviewed in part of this article, and she said graduate students are at an in-between phase in their professional development, and they are often asked to function in a capacity that they don't feel ready to handle, which increases the likelihood that existing feelings of imposterism would be more salient. So here we are, graduate students are often thrown into this environment, and even though they've done undergrad, graduate school is very different. Now, Lieberman's theory of saliency, what she was talking about, is directly in line with the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you're not familiar with it, is a cognitive bias where novice individuals may be unaware of their inability, right? So it's like, I don't know enough to know that I don't know. So I'm in you're in a psych class. My undergraduate was done at a really large university out in the Western United States. And my introductory bio class had over 200 students in it. And I think about that class and I think, like, I didn't know what I knew and what I didn't know. And honestly, nobody else would have noticed either, right? And so that's something that she's kind of talking about, is that once you get a little bit more into what you're doing and you are more highly skilled, or you're in a more acute area of your field, you become more aware of some of those deficits. You become acutely aware that you maybe don't know as much as the people around you. And that's what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, and why it was partially hypothesized that imposter feelings may influence graduate students more, largely just due to where they are in their area of study. So, given all of these theories, in 2008, I was the lead researcher on a study conducted here at Wichita State. So the purpose of the study was to identify imposter traits within the Wichita State student population. So are there even any? Is this even a thing, right? Maybe Wichita State, because we're all so great, we're immune. That was my hopeful finding. No, just kidding. But we wanted to identify imposter traits within the Wichita State student population, and we wanted to compare the prevalence of those traits across 3 levels of academic study. So specifically, we wanted to look at undergraduate honors, and graduate students. And that was, again, in line with some of the work that Lieberman had done, and also with the Dunning-Kruger effect. Like, is there really a difference? Now, one of the things that I talked to you about as we were kind of gearing up, Heather, was that we did look for other controls, right? So we wanted to look at, what about if you're a first-generation student? What about if you're male or female? What about if you aren't a first-generation student, but you just don't feel connected to Wichita State? Like, you just don't have resources in the environment where you're learning. And so we actually included questions within our study design in order to run statistical analysis on those as well. So I'm just going to get rid of my My screen is showing me you guys, and I don't know if you're seeing that, but I'll move it just in case. So to measure the prevalence of imposter characteristics, we use the Clance Imposter Phenomenon Scale. We used the entire 20 questions of the SIPs, and we administered it electronically. We used Qualtrics, and we did a completely randomized sample, and so I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in just a minute. But as I previously mentioned, the SIPs is a 20-item scale. So it specifically measures one's need to be the very best. And in that Clance Imposter Syndrome cycle, that is listed as perfectionism, okay? And then it measures a fear of failure, denial of competence, and discount of praise, right? So someone gives you a compliment and you're like, no, I don't deserve it, right? Or they say, wow, you did really good at this. And you're like, no, you know. So it's looking specifically at that. It also looks at fear and guilt associated with success and superhuman expectations. So do you expect that you have to know everything all the time? Okay, is that realistic? That's not the question it answers, but it does look at if that's one of your expectations. Now, these 5 unique factors have been shown to reliably differentiate imposters from non-imposters. And again, I put the alpha values there just so that you would have them. Now, as promised, here's the Clance Imposter Syndrome Scale. This is just 6 of the 20 questions. So this is what it looks like. It's a 5-point Likert scale from not at all true to very true. So the first sample question I have on here is, I have often succeeded on a task or tasks, even though I was afraid that I would not do well before I undertook the task. Okay. And the second one says, I can give the impression that I'm more competent than I really am. The third, I avoid evaluations if possible and have a dread of others evaluating me. The fourth, when people praise me for something I've accomplished, I'm afraid I won't be able to live up to their expectations of me in the future. And the fifth, I sometimes think I obtained my present position or gained my present success because I happened to be in the right place at the right time or knew the right people. And the sixth and last question, I'm afraid people important to me may find out that I'm not as capable as they think I am. So that kind of gives you a taste of what some of those questions look like. Again, those questions fall into the previously mentioned domains, right? And so if you were to conduct a factor analysis, you would find a pretty strong factor loading within those domains because the internal consistency of the scale is quite high. So they are incredibly effective at measuring what they purport to measure. Now, once participants completed the scale, their score is calculated out of 100, and we just used the well-established cutoffs for adults, since everyone taking the SIPs at the university had to be 18 or above in order to sign consent. So we use the existing cutoffs from the literature, which are as follows. So if you got 35 or less, then you were classified as mild, which I would go out on a limb here and say it's like mild to like not at all, right? It's like baseline, you don't feel like you're an imposter. Maybe you have a couple of imposter characteristics, but it's nothing maybe worth noting. It's nothing clinically significant. The next one is 36 to 55, which is a classification of moderate. And then we have 56 to 75, which is high. So you're experiencing a lot of frequent feelings related to imposterism. And likely if you're in that high to severe range, severe being above 76, you're experiencing feelings so frequently that it may be interfering with other relevant cognitions or trains of thought. And it may even be influencing your behavior around other individuals. So that's worth noting there too. So the SIPs, I wanted to just point out down here at the bottom, assesses frequency and severity of symptoms. So the higher the score, the more frequent and the more serious, or the more likely that the symptoms will interfere with someone's life. So that's kind of what I was just telling you before about the high and the severe levels especially. Okay, so In addition to the SIPs, participants were asked demographic questions such as their race, ethnicity, and gender, and they were also asked a series of exploratory questions which were used during final analysis. Now, those are the questions that I mentioned to you briefly before, and that's about like feeling connected to the university, being a first-generation student. So some of those sample questions that I added to the questionnaire where I feel courses I took in high school prepared me for my undergraduate experience. What I was looking for with that question is, did people feel, were they more inclined to feel like they were an imposter if they felt like they were never prepared for this? If you felt well prepared but disconnected from the university, did you still feel feelings of imposterism, or was it more likely, were you more likely to feel those feelings if you felt unprepared for the university experience and then felt disconnected from the university socially as well, right? And then again, the second question example I had here is I feel like I'm an active part of the WSU community. So that kind of is along those same lines, okay? So I mentioned to you that the participants were randomized. So we used 3 completely randomized samples of students who were selected from the Wichita State University population. So to do that, we basically went through the appropriate administrative channels, and Dr. Birdsall and the psych department requested from dean's lists and things like that. And we ran an algorithm to get a completely randomized sample of all of the students. And then we sent the survey out and said, you were selected at random. We would love for you to participate in this survey. A total of 141 students responded to the survey. I want to mention that we did offer some incentives. Students who were identified as undergraduate students were able to get SONA credit if they were, oh, sorry, I'm misspeaking. All of the students actually, because we wanted the incentive to be equal and appropriate across the 3 different domains and populations, were eligible to win a gift card. It was to Walmart, one of our partners, and so they were eligible to go and enter a drawing for that, for completing the survey. So we had 141 students total. A scale reliability analysis indicated every question on the SIPs was important, so participants who declined to answer 1 or more of the questions were not included in our final analysis. That left us with 31 undergrads, 44 undergraduate honor students, and 32 graduate students, totaling 107. So we were really happy with that number because we didn't have incredibly high attrition, which we thought was very promising. And we really appreciated the students' willingness to contribute. Because of what we were looking at, we didn't exclude students based on year, major of study, or anything else. Our exclusion criteria was very low, and that's largely just because of the nature of the study. It was beneficial for us to have as many students as possible for our data analysis based on our the power analysis that I had run before conducting the study. So results, let me tell you what we found. Okay, so the validity to the scale was similar to previous studies. Our complex alpha was 0.92, so that was incredibly strong. And our first hypothesis was confirmed. Students in all 3 groups did experience feelings of imposter syndrome. So the mean for all 3 groups, all 3, dear friends, fell within the high range. So that's between 56 and 75 if you remember. And these are the means for undergraduate honors, undergraduate, and graduate. You'll see they are all above 60. Okay. This disproved our second research question, which, if you remember, was that on average, graduate students would have greater feelings of imposterism than both undergraduate students and students in the undergraduate honors program. And remember, I based that on that Dunning-Kruger effect, saying that, like, well, they are like in the nitty-gritty of a very specific program. We expect them to know all of the answers. They are no longer in the stage of gathering general knowledge and taking general education courses. Like, I expect you to be a professional on psychology. Well, guess what? That didn't matter a whole lot. Everyone's mean was pretty equal in all 3 groups. So that was incredibly significant to us. And you can see here, I have listed, of course, also the ends, which I previously gave you, but the standard deviation and the standard error, so that you can kind of have some context to those means as well. Now, the analysis of variance, I already mentioned to you at 0.92. I did use a Bonferroni's correction to compare all three groups, and it showed no significance between the three groups, which is not that big of a surprise, given that I ran in ANOVA and all of the means were incredibly similar. Now, additional analysis showed no correlation between demographic factors. So there was no correlation between genders like male, female, transgender, gender nonconforming, race, ethnicity, not even for first generation students. There was no significant correlation. It pretty much affected everyone equally. Now, one thing I do want to say is that the N on a lot of those is going to be incredibly small, given that our sample size was only 107 or whatever I said, 106 total, right? And so that's just something to consider and was a limitation of the present study. But that was incredibly significant to me. Now, additional analysis revealed among the three groups, there was no correlation between imposter score and year of study. And there was also no statistically significant correlation between imposter score and any of the exploratory factors, which I just began telling you about, but I failed to mention that that include perceived preparation for college, closeness with one's support network, or a perceived sense of belonging to the WSU community. There was also no significant correlation there. So we looked at a lot of stuff here, and basically what we found is that being a student is equally hard on everybody. And so resources are kind of needed to mitigate that effect and help students feel like they can truly be successful. Now, obviously, putting some of those structures into place is beyond the scope of this study, but I included some implications nonetheless. Now, before I talk about some of these implications, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you to, let's see if my screen decides it wants to be friendly today. But I'm going to, let's see. Hold on. I'm going to stop the share for 1 second until I find what I'm looking for you. We're going to watch a brief video. It's like 2 minutes. 2 minutes. And then I'm going to talk to you about the implications, okay? So give me 1 second. I'm going to go back. I found what I was looking for, so I'm going to go back to the share. Okay. Here we go. I'll do this. Hopefully you're getting it. Okay. So I thought that this video, you all could see it, right? Okay, and hear it. Okay, just checking. Oh, okay. I was just looking at the chat for a moment. I apologize. But this video summed up nicely what we just were talking about on a large scale, but also on like, so on a macro level, but also on a micro level of what students at WSU are experiencing. And now I'm gonna go ahead and go back into the implications so we can talk about, well, what do you do? And some of those, of course, were mentioned in that video. So, but in detail, oh, let's see if it wants to, what am I trying to do? Nope, don't need that. Hold on, hold on. Let's see, give me 1 second. Oh, I can just go down here. There we go. Oh my word. Okay. So what does this mean for students who struggle with feelings of fraudulence and insecurity and maybe kind of caught in that imposter cycle? The first thing is the research that we literally just did told us that you are not alone. The Journal of Behavioral Health has found that 70% of individuals likely experience imposter syndrome sometimes throughout their life. And our research indicated a lot of that is probably going to happen during these education years. So you're definitely not alone in those feelings. The feelings that you have are normal. They might not feel normal, but they are. And so having that perspective is sometimes helpful. In addition to having perspective, recognize and combat thinking traps. So I talk a lot in my role as a psychologist about thinking traps. And what I mean when I say thinking traps are cognitive distortions that are actually common across people, varying ages, races, ethnicities, and gender. So for example, we often confuse our feelings with fact, and that is an incredibly common cognitive practice. And part of the reason we do that is because if we are the ones thinking a thought, we are naturally inclined to believe that it is true. We're not going to say like, oh, I thought, that must be wrong. Like, so just because we have these feelings doesn't mean they're fact. And so we can distance ourselves from some of the feelings that we're having. And we can do that a lot of different ways. We can use mindfulness techniques. We can use some acceptance commitment techniques to realize like I'm having this feeling, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. And then we can also use our behaviors to combat our thoughts. So a lot of times we talk about a triangle in psychology, and we have cognitions or thoughts, and we have feelings, and we have behaviors as the three separate parts of the triangle. And they kind of work like cogs, and that they influence each other. So we can take time to think, like if you're thinking like I'm, the worst, I'm not worthwhile, I'm only here because of luck. Are you really only there because of luck? If you made it to class that day, there's a very good chance you're there because you got out of bed, you brushed your hair, you brushed your teeth, you put on clothes, you figured out transportation, and you physically made it there. Now, in the Zoom era, okay, physically making it there might not be a thing, but you at least turned on the computer. So we can use some of our behaviors to counteract some of these thinking traps that maybe maintain some of those imposter traits. Now, the other thing you can do is not to expect perfection. Okay, so we talked briefly about perfectionism, but the reality is it's okay not to know something. It would be incredibly unreasonable if we expected you to know everything about everything. That just makes no sense. And so keeping that in mind, like, oh, I don't have to know the answer to every question. That helps too. Also, talk with a trusted friend or mentor. I think that can be especially helpful, and especially if those individuals are people who think highly of you, because they can remind you of some of the positive characteristics and attributes that you bring to certain situations or groups. And that they really admire about you. And that can be very valuable. Now, one of the things that I regret we didn't look at, that's a limitation of the study also, is that we didn't look at overlaps between mood disorders. So we didn't look at the prevalence of anxiety or depression or anything like that. I did not include any screeners for that. And that, again, was because I felt like it was not necessary in order to answer our research questions. But But if you do feel like I have these feelings of imposterism, but I think it's more than that, I would say it's incredibly important for students to seek professional help from like a licensed clinical psychologist like myself, though I'm biased, or also even just at CAPS, they have great resources over there. So I just would add that in addition to talking with a trusted friend or mentor. And it's consistent with my last point, which is to consult other resources as needed. And I've included some here. Now, these resources are lay resources. So what I didn't want to do was to bog you all down with a ton of research studies. As cute as that is, no, I did not want that, because I wanted it to be this information and these resources to be very palatable to a broad range of people so that you can use them, but you can also share them with people. So a lot of them are like from Psychology Today. The video that I showed is actually from Time magazine that did a whole section on imposter syndrome. And I've included that there. And then the New York Times recently actually published some articles, again, that are like for the everyday person. So, you're not getting lost in the Cronbach's alpha and all the nitty gritty numbers of the scales, because I personally just didn't feel like that was necessary in order for help to be beneficial. So I've included some of these resources for you so that you can look at them on your own, or you can distribute them, or hopefully it'll provide any more insight if there's a specific section that you have any questions about. So that's what I prepared to share with you all today. I want to go ahead and open it for questions. If there's anything that I didn't address or anything that stuck out to you, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
First, I want to say thank you very much for the presentation. If you wouldn't mind sharing those slides in email to me, and I can distribute it to the whole organization.
Yeah.
For anybody who didn't, and then I can attach the link for the YouTube video for them to watch later. Sure. I guess I do have like a question about, so I know your study, you didn't really dive deeper into it. So in my study with Dr. Heron, we do ask a question in there, and I know we're still collecting data through SONA for it, but as of right now, when I look at the data that I have available, we asked the question about, do you feel like you would be more connected if you had a mentor or a group of people, like we separated into questions, or a group of people who experience similar feelings that you have? Do you think that would help you? Ironically enough, everybody says no.
Yeah.
I don't understand that.
Well, that's actually very consistent with imposter syndrome. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because what I think is that it's a reflection of this idea of like, I'm a fraud, and if other people know that I'm a fraud, then the jig is up, right? And so even though the question implies that the people who you would be confiding in have these same feelings, the idea of sharing your fraudulence and kind of being outed, if you will, I think is still so inherent within the principle of imposter syndrome that it prohibits people from sharing how they're feeling, even if people might be feeling the same way. And I think also another part of that is the idea that it would then open them up to criticism, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think that that's just so inherent within imposter syndrome that it makes it difficult for people to connect, even if the people who they're seeking to connect with are having some of those same feelings. And so I'm glad that you asked that question. And I think it's actually very validating of some of the traits underpinning imposter syndrome.
And then in another question that we ask about, if they're pursuing for higher education, because our study is looking at first generation students, but like you said, across the board, everybody's experiencing imposter syndrome. So I kind of expected that to happen because it's a very competitive nature in college. So Dr. Heron said that maybe later we can go back and do a qualitative and do more interviews for students and ask them like, I think the imposter syndrome was actually lower in our study for first-gen students than it was for the overall other student population. And we don't know if it's because they reserve services like what Nelson has, which is like TRIO, student support services. Maybe they have some connections on campus, whether they don't think it's like a mentor necessarily, but they do have people to help them and guide them in the right direction. So that was interesting. And then we didn't look at the fact like McNair, like how McNair prepares a lot of first generation students for higher education. So there's some things that, like you said, you can't put everything in one study.
Yeah, it's true. There are a lot of different complex factors, I think, that can go into imposterism, but also can kind of exacerbate some existing feelings. The video talked about how it might tie in with some different, more long-term psychopathology. And I wanted to touch on that briefly, so I'm glad you brought that up. It talked about, well, let me back up. So as a psychologist, I believe strongly in the biopsychosocial model, meaning that a lot of what we experience doesn't probably come from just one source. We have our own biology, our own family history, both physical and emotional, family history of anxiety or depression or what have you, right? And so that's kind of biological, that predisposition. We also have our own kind of disposition, if you will, right? So I have 2 kids and they just are totally different, right? We have our own personality that's kind of emerging that plays into it. And so that kind of covers the biopsychological systems there, but then we also have these social aspects, right? What do our family structures look like? What resources have we had available in regards to education, right? Did we feel well prepared? Are we a first generation student who feels well prepared, or do we not feel well prepared, even if you're not a first generation student? So a lot of these things, I think there's a great deal of intersectionality, and that affects how often we feel some of these imposter traits, how strongly we feel them, and how much they impact us. So like I could maybe feel them, but then, shrug them off, whereas someone else maybe would not be able to, and they really internalize those just because that's part of who they are, and that's part of their nature. And it is definitely hard to quantify all of that in a study, especially one study. So yeah, that's definitely true. And I think it's important to keep in mind as you're reviewing this research and also as you're interfacing with students and other professionals.
Yeah, I just thought it was just weird that they would answer that they didn't feel like they were prepared for higher education, but then also didn't feel like they needed any type of assistance to feel more connected. So it was just, I was like, wow, that's so against each other. It's like 2 opposing forces. No, I don't feel like I'm getting what I need, but I also don't want your help either. So it was kind of funny.
Yeah, that's complex. It's hard. It's definitely hard. And that is an interesting finding. So I'm excited to see where your results kind of come out.
We also found so far that so we have 168 right now that have identified as first gen students.
Yeah.
Of just the first gen students that did the survey, 67% of them don't even know that we have a first generation student organization on campus. Yeah. And we advertise everywhere, which is so crazy. I mean, we really do. We advertise everywhere, and we even like co-host with other student organizations, and we're working with the Senate to become an agency, but it would be like 7 or 8 different underrepresented student populations that would be working together to get more publicity for our organizations. But it's just so crazy that, like you said, it's like we're not connected to campus, but everything's there and available at the same time, to some limits, but it's there.
Yeah. It's definitely challenging. I think that you all do a great job at what you do. And I also recognize you have your work cut out for you, because there are things like imposter syndrome and stuff that may prohibit people from utilizing some of these fantastic services.
So did you experience imposter syndrome? Is that what made you want to do research on it?
So I first heard about it when I was I think I definitely experienced it to some degree, for sure. But I first heard about it when I was applying to graduate school. One of my friends said, well, if you get in, you'll sure find out what imposter syndrome is. And I said, what do you mean? And so I had started kind of looking into it, and then just talking with other graduate students. There was just this pervasive feeling of like, maybe I only got here because of X, Y, and Z, and I don't know if I'm equipped to fulfill my clinical responsibilities. And, I just kind of started wondering a little bit about these pervasive feelings, just that I had experienced myself, definitely, but also just anecdotally, that seemed so just prevalent among the student body. And so I was fortunate enough that my advisor allowed me to kind of head up this research. So yeah, it was definitely great.
So one of the things I would say is that being a newer organization on campus, that does not surprise me. You said 67% didn't know about it. Yeah. So that's where you almost have to hang in there until you get critical mass. It's a term that we use with adopting new software, right? When you get a third, those are the early adopters. You get up over 50%. And then suddenly it's just like, it takes off and everybody does it because, the last third, we're just waiting to see, are we going to adopt this or didn't hear about it or whatever. So 2 or 3, you almost have to build a record, okay, and have something when they go see that website or go see that Twitter account or something. There has to be things there that they go, oh yeah, this is, wow, this applies to me, and then it starts to click. I need to get involved in this.
I almost feel like when Jess was talking to Tanya yesterday, she actually had to leave, but I was talking to her yesterday when we went to campus because they canceled our bake sale and we had to pick up all of our stuff out of the locker so it didn't go bad. And I was telling her that I sent out the survey to ask students, what do they need from our organization to feel more connected? Because I do feel like, well, yes, we're a student organization, but we're all from different diversities and we're connecting with each other in different ways and we all have different resources available. We're almost like a self-care group. That's almost what it feels like. I mean, we're first generation students, but we have other students that aren't first gen that connect with us because I don't think they know where all the resources are either.
No, they don't. Because I mean, if it wasn't recently that their parents or their friend or their older sibling went through this college, they're pretty much out on their own.
Yeah. So I worry because like my son's going to be starting college next semester with me. So he'll be starting his undergrad. I'll be starting my grad and he'll be a gen and a half. I am his only first gen help, like to go to higher education. And I still don't know everything. Natanya taught me so many things yesterday on campus. I was like, oh, I didn't know that I could go inside diversity and inclusion and do 10 free printings. I didn't know that I could order stuff online for like, I guess they have like a food locker there. I didn't know that I could order shampoo and stuff like that. I don't know these things, but I was also a returning adult student and my orientation is completely different than a first year student who's coming to campus, which they get those resources, but I don't know how much of that they listen to sometimes and keep mental note and then have to be able to recall it later because it's so much being thrown at you at one time. Right. And there's so many of you going through the orientation also. So
well, and I think all these factors kind of feed into and make that imposter cycle go round and round, right? Oh, I didn't know that. How come I didn't know that? I could have been helped, and it's like, I'm really not cut out for this, and then that circle starts happening. And you can't, instead you could say, oh, wow, I found a new gem. This is really cool. I need to tell other people about it. Maybe they don't know about it either. I mean, and you just got to shift that mindset of how you're going to broadcast not only through your own feelings and things but to help others with that. And so I did not know there was this term. I mean, I had it when I went through college in the 80s. Okay. So the 1980s. So this was not broadly known or talked about or anything. And I finally, in my 30s or so, just said, wait a minute, I don't think that's true. And I, have that little conversation with yourself to turn it around.
Yeah. And I think that's very important because I know when I started this research and I first pitched it, like I said, my advisor was very supportive in the end. But when I started it, I was told that this was not a thing, like in 2018. And I'm like, but I can show you research studies and I can show you a validated scale. And it was like, you're just making this up because you feel inadequate. And I'm like, can you even say that to me? Like,
well, that's what we were talking about last semester. Remember before we ended our semester net, we were talking about how first gen students, and this could be anybody, but I think for us, for the research that we decided that we were going to try to do for first gen students in Imposter was, we don't only feel out of place at home, but we also feel out of place on campus. So we really have two, it's like you're entering, like you said, you're entering a whole new endeavor in your life. And unless you know the people that you can connect to and different resources are available to you, you would self-doubt yourself. I know I did.
Yeah. It's like jumping from the old to the new, right? It's like jumping across a creek. Mid jump, you're really wondering, am I going to make it? What was I thinking when I started this leap, you know? And it's that feeling.
Yeah. And even more things that I could add to the research would be, is your home support, are they there for you? Are they rooting for you? Or are they doubting your ability too, because it's so unknown for them? Like, I know in our family, education wasn't something we ever talked about. So the fact that I even said I wanted to go to college as a 37-year-old adult, they were like, you should have already figured out what you were going to do with your life. We can't support this. Like, you're wasting your time. So then you have to like, okay, well, that's not healthy for me. So now you don't have that family support system that you had before. And now you're by yourself, and then you go to college and you talk to other students and they're like, it's so I found this really weird. So when I first originally thought I was going to be a clinical PhD major and I was going to pursue doctoral for that, nobody wanted to talk about their ideas. It was like, if I give you any information, you're going to steal it and then I won't have a chance to get in. So they keep everything to themselves. But I've met so many people, when I tell them, they're like, oh, so you're a psychology major, so you can go clinical. And I'm like, no, I'm going a different route. I'm going to go educational psychology, because I think that's where my calling is, to connect more people to higher education. And they're like, oh, okay, well, I want to talk to you about a subject that I'm interested in. They don't feel like I'm a threat then. It's so weird. And then I give them resources. I'm like, well, have you started looking at who you would want to work under for a clinical? Like, you have to write your essay. It has to be directed towards somebody who you would see yourself working with for a 7 to 9 year period. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that. And then you have to pick a research topic. Like, what are you interested in researching? Well, I didn't know that either. Don't they teach me that in school? And a lot of times they're not first gen students who are talking to me about this. And I'm just going, and they go, well, you're first gen. How do you know all this stuff? And I'm just like, because I talk to other people, and like I make resources, and I make connections with other professors, and I ask them questions. And I've had some professors tell me that if that I'm asking too many questions and they don't have time to answer it, but that's okay. There are so many other professors that will make time for you. So it's so crazy. It's like a secret society, and nobody wants to talk about anything, and it's so competitive, but they feel the same way.
Yeah. I would maintain that in a industry that changes a lot, and I don't know what you call it, maybe it's got a different title, but it sure smells and looks like this. I mean, when you think about IT and how fast information technology changes, I mean, literally every 3 years it changes. So the amount of information, I mean, it's just changing all the time. So you get into these meetings and people say, oh, that's just their personality. They don't want to talk. I'm thinking they don't want to talk because they don't want to expose themselves on what they do and don't know. But if everybody puts their cards out, then you're going to, because I'm in project management, okay, I need everybody contributing fully and safely to the whole to get the product out the door. And so I would maintain it's not just college, but it's even in different industries more prevalent than others because of how quickly it changes. That's my hypothesis. And of course, I'm not going to do a study on it, but.
No, I agree. I think you're right. Right now, I'm just comparing it to college because that's the most competitive thing that I've really had to do. Before this, I drove a semi truck. I got into my own truck. I did my deliveries. I wasn't competing with anybody for my job. I had my list of duties, and I didn't really talk to anybody during the day.
Right.
So, yeah, but in the tech industry, you go to these places and you see people. I mean, it's highly competitive for the jobs. I mean, well, I'm sure you did this in your research, Ashley, was when you looked at some of your studies, I'm sure you saw that like law firms, they strive for people with imposter syndrome because it makes you the most competitive, and you're the most willing to work the late hours and stay on the weekends and never take time for your family. Like, they look, I think they honestly ask questions just to see how much you'll give away of yourself to make them successful.
And
I
it's motivating to prove that you're competent.
Yes. It's sad. But it's such an interesting topic. And you're right. I'm sure you know who Dr. Clark is. When I told him that the research I was doing and he connected me with you, he was like, I should have gotten on this bandwagon. He was like, I think, you know, whenever this topic came up a few years ago, I kind of just go, I don't really know if that's something worth even really investing a lot of time in. He goes, and now it's just becoming more known, even outside of the Wichita State University. He's like, I see a lot of it everywhere in emails and conversations with other faculty or other colleagues. He's like, I see it a lot everywhere. So it's really, it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I appreciate you all letting me share my research with you. Thank you so much for inviting me to do so.
Oh, you bet. This was awesome. And I think that's one of the reasons why some people don't want to study in groups either.
Yeah.
And so they actually end up shortchanging their educational learning process because they have this and they're not willing to get involved in a group. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good observation.
It's just so sad because it's like you see all these problems and like you said, it's so complex. You don't even, how do you begin to even tear it down other than saying change your thought processing or include other people when society on the other side of it's going, wait, but if you give away all your secrets, nothing makes you better than the next person. So keep it all to yourself.
Right. Well, thank you again. I don't know how long I know I'm an administrator, but I'm scared it's going to cut us off. I don't know if our meeting was only an hour. So I'm like wrapping things up because I'm scared it's going to just go and get sucked into the black hole that is the internet.
No, thank you so much for presenting. And like I said, if you share your presentation with me, I'll send it out to the rest of the organization for anybody who didn't have time, and then I'll copy the YouTube link for them to look at. I think this is really great. And I know Annette loved talking about it too. I mean, her story, I mean, she had people in tears at the end of December, like we were all crying. Or May.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Hey, bye-bye.
Thank you.